A lot of the time, gritty rules are suggested as a way to make our D&D campaigns more difficult or more realistic, keeping in mind that we're talking about our game of pretend. And both of these things can be true, but they aren't the biggest difference. Today, Mills Family Experience asked, and the Tank Class supporters here on YouTube and over on Patreon selected the topic of how the use of gritty rules impacts play at the table compared to a game that doesn't have them. If you enjoy these videos, please consider joining the Tank Class ranks and voting your preferred videos to the top of my to-do list. Some of the most commonly used gritty rules include those surrounding rests. Turning a short rest into an hour and a long rest into 7 days has a pretty big impact on a game. Also, using rules for sleeping in armor or for the gathering of sufficient nutrition from food and water to be able to look after yourself. Added rules to complicate or take longer, challenging travel. The encumbrance variant, requiring people to not carry around 150-pound packs without any sort of change on their behavior. And those sorts of things tend to drive us down a grittier path. And there's some good things and some bad things about all of those things. Obviously, they add to the challenge, making things more difficult because getting a day in between a couple of battles when you're trying to delve into a dungeon that has many of them is a super big hardship, which means that you're probably not going to take short rests nearly as often, and you might have to stretch your resources a lot further to be able to deal with it. And then also the difficulty can be increased because if you're not sleeping in armor, then when you wake up in the middle of the night, your plate mail wearing warrior is in a pretty rough spot when they're now running around in their nightshirt. Essentially, from a difficulty standpoint, things just get harder on the resource management, and or you get put into situations that are harder when you're utilizing these style of rules. At the same time, one of the main reasons why I like to use these kinds of rules is because they increase the realism, which is a silly word, really. I like to use the term verisimilitude. They basically let you look down into the world and say, yeah, this makes sense in the world as to how my character would act. For instance, for me, not using encumbrance variants gets really, really frustrating when I think in my head of this person running around in 80 pounds of armor and gear with a 70-pound pack on their shoulders, and yet somehow they're doing somersaults or swinging from a rope or climbing up the side of a mountain as if they were completely unencumbered. That just breaks a little bit of the immersion in my personal brain, and so I like those kinds of rules because they help to make that verisimilitude, that immersion, a little bit more possible for me personally. But for other people, it's just a huge drag as they're dealing with this realism that's getting in the way of the fantasy that they're trying to tell. And that's because the real difference between gritty rules and regular rules is actually more one of focus and minutia and tracking. It requires a certain kind of person to enjoy focusing in on every last little detail. And we often run into a little bit of a problem because DMs are sort of predisposed for being this kind of person. If you're busy building your own world and you're figuring out the lore and the dogma of your gods and you're deciding on the trade products of your various realms, then you're the kind of person that is likely to get some enjoyment out of focusing upon how much your equipment weighs or how many spells you have to a minute level when you're worrying about making them last over the course of X amount of time, or wondering about whether or not you're sleeping in a light suit of spare armor that you lug around, whether you have mules that carry things for you so that you can bring them from dungeon to dungeon. All of those kinds of details are going to be exciting to you as a player if, as a DM, that's the kind of thing you're excited by. But it takes that certain kind of person, because when we are looking at that, fantasy seekers, people who are looking to immerse themselves in this fantasy story, they often tend to be the ones that are hunting for more realism, while challenge seekers are the ones that are hunting for more difficulty. But in both cases, their fantasies and their challenge is ruined if they are not also interested in becoming precise and controlled record keepers and in focusing on that minutia. If that isn't for those players, then the gritty rules will create a lot of frustration. And that's what I've seen in my tables, has been that, I get players from all over the country and in some cases the world that come to my paid games, and I can't predict beforehand what kind of people they are. I get them into a session 0 and we start talking about things like that, and we start suggesting different rule sets. And ultimately, people might lean into the concept of a greater challenge, or they might lean into the concept of more realism. But in play, it is rare the player that is leaning in to the record-keeping side of things. The bookkeeping is just not as exciting to most players as it is to me personally. And that's probably going to be the case for a lot of tables. So when you are pushing for gritty rules, my advice, Mill's family experience, my advice would be to consider how much extra tracking and minutia you're getting from that portion of things, and try to make sure that you are selling it that way to your players in a session 0 in order to actually gauge whether or not this is the kind of game that they would be enjoying. You're looking for an immersive experience. You're looking for a player that's going to be excited by as much realism as possible, and you're looking for a player who's willing to keep track of every last little thing. If you happen to be playing with a whole bunch of forever DMs and you finally get them into a game, they're probably going to be your ideal audience if you're looking for gritty rules. But generally speaking, that would be my thought and advice. You've done it and watched all the way to the end. Thank you. You're appreciated. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and consider joining the Tank Class supporters who make these videos possible. Thanks again, and until next time, happy adventuring.